Vi ska fortsätta att vara patientcentrerade och titta på hur gör patienter själva när de vill innovera och hitta egna lösningar för sin vård framåt. Vi ska prata om patientdriven, patientcentrerad och patientdesignad. Vi ska få träffa en diabetespatient som också är digital innovatör. Hon har skapat the Do-It-Yourself Pancreas System. En presentation ni kommer få höra nu som kommer att hållas helt på engelska. She's a digital innovator. She has traveled all the way from the US, from Seattle, to share her innovation in this area, this field. Warm welcome to Dana Lewis.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you.
The stage is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. When I like to talk about innovation, I like to remind us that when we talk about healthcare, it's very easy to forget a simple fact about being a patient, which is we're very, very different than the rest of people who are in healthcare. If you work in healthcare as a researcher or as a healthcare professional, you have trained and gone to school and chosen this as your profession. But when you're diagnosed with a healthcare condition and you become a patient, it's like being struck by lightning. You have no way to prepare. You don't really know what's coming. You just have a very clear before and after of what's happened. And I've learned this very, very well. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 14. And I went from being a normal, typical high school student to suddenly having to think about my blood sugar all the time. And there are so many things that impact my blood sugar. And so what I realized when I was diagnosed many years later is it's a lifelong learning journey. I'm constantly learning new things about my health and things that impact my health. For example, in type 1 diabetes, it's very easy to think of it as a simple disease. The body no longer produces insulin, so you need to inject it or use an insulin pump. And you should count the carbohydrates in what you're eating and measure your food. But it's not quite that simple. There are a number of things that impact your blood sugar. For example, there's things that make your blood sugar go up, like the food that you're eating, being sick, being jet lagged, exercise, stress. There's a number of things that will make it go up. But there are also things that will make your blood sugar go down. Sometimes exercise will make it go up, but other times it will make your blood sugar go down. And if you set out for a run, it's very hard to know if it's going to be one that makes you go up or down. So there's a number of things that go into impacting my blood sugar that I have no control over and no ability to measure. So yes, I can measure the insulin that I choose to take, and I can decide how much I want to eat and guess for that, but there's so many other things coming into play. And also, insulin is great. It's a life-saving drug, but it's not perfect because when you inject insulin, it takes 60 to 90 minutes for most fast-acting insulins to actually kick into your body. So if you sit down to eat breakfast this morning and you injected insulin as soon as you saw your food, it would actually be about now that your insulin be taking into effect, which is why you often see people's blood sugar going up and then down later, because the timing matters of all these things. And that's why people's graphs, if you look at their continuous glucose monitor graphs, you'll see lines like this that go up and down. And it doesn't matter, even if they do everything right and perfect, their body might change one day and suddenly everything is different. So it's really, really hard and you're constantly learning. And even now, after 17 years of living with type 1 diabetes, I still feel like I'm learning all of these things that are impacting my body. And a lot of us are fortunate. You live in a country where insulin is provided to people. In the United States, you may have heard about the pricing crisis around insulin, where not everybody can access or afford insulin. And around the world, it's still not a given that people with diabetes can access insulin. It's a huge problem. But for those of us who can access insulin and other tools, there are tools that will help. There's what we call the continuous glucose monitor. There's a sensor I wear on my arm that transmits data every 5 minutes, which is great. I no longer have to do finger sticks several times a day. But this device isn't perfect. It's made by manufacturers. It comes shipped, and it has certain alarms on it that I can't change. I can't make them louder. I can't make the sounds different. So who here has kids who sometimes don't hear their parents' voices? Yes. So when you have diabetes, you get alert fatigue. And so like kids kind of train themselves to stop listening to their parents, your brain decides this alarm's not that important. So it would be nice to be able to change the sound and the type of alarm, but you can't do that. You can't change it. So it's really frustrating as a patient to just be left with a device that's supposed to be helpful, but really isn't that helpful. Insulin pumps are similarly good for some things. They keep you from having to manually inject insulin multiple times a day. However, they're by design going to overdose you with insulin if your blood sugar is low, because it doesn't know that your blood sugar is dropping and you need less insulin. They are dumb. They're doing what they're designed to do, which is give you insulin constantly, but it requires the human to think, my blood sugar is dropping. I need less or no insulin right now, and to stop the pump. So it's really, really hard because the human is in the middle of having to look at the glucose data, look at the insulin pump data, think about what to do. And this isn't just once or twice a day. In the course of a day, a person with diabetes might make hundreds of decisions about things that will impact their blood sugar. So they're doing this constantly throughout the day, and it's a huge amount of mental labor that is kind of invisible to the rest of the world. And that's what makes diabetes so hard. You've got not perfect devices, you have to do a lot of work, and sometimes humans want to sleep or go to work and not constantly be doing math in our head. But right now, this is what manual diabetes care looks like, and that's why it's incredibly hard. And that means, again, blood sugar graphs can look like this. I share this graph, which is mine from 2013, for two reasons. One is because my doctor asked me to bring in a week's worth of data to discuss with him. And the only way I had access to my data in 2013 was to take out my phone, take a picture of the physical receiver, email that to myself, copy and paste the picture into Microsoft Excel, and print it out. So this is literally what I handed my doctor. And when you look at this, you might be wondering, well, what do you do with that? I look at it and say, what can he do with that? And he looked at it and said, okay, thanks for bringing your data. And that was it. This is not a useful way to look at data. But the reason it was so hard is because the FDA regulatory approved software for my medical device was only approved for PC computers. And I had a Mac computer. So I was not allowed access to my data off my device, and there was also no way to get data to my phone, so it was incredibly frustrating. My biggest frustration with all of this, though, is the fact that, like I said, CGM alarms are hard to hear when you've been hearing them for year after year after year, and you have no ability to change the sound. I also have a special skill. I am the world's best sleeper. So I will sleep through anything, CGM alarm, somebody talking to me, noise, everything. It's great, except for the pesky fact that I have type 1 diabetes, and if my blood sugar goes low, I need to hear that alarm. So by 2013, I was really frustrated because I had used multiple CGMs from different manufacturers, and I had called each of them multiple times and said, hey, your device isn't perfect. Can you change it? Can you make the alarm louder? Can you make the alarm different? Can I turn some of them off and on and different? And the answer was, most people do okay with it. You're the only one with this problem. Which is not true, because if you Google louder CGM alarm, there's like 60,000 results on Google. So clearly, even back in 2013, I was not the only one with this problem. But the other frustrating thing is they said, we're working on it. It'll be out in the next version. Well, the timeline for the next version for medical device hardware is usually, say, 5 years away. And that night, I would have to go to sleep worrying about what it would be like if I slept through my alarm. So I was constantly worried about that. It was very, very stressful. Even though I had these tools, I was doing everything right, I still had this very real and legitimate fear that I would go very low in my sleep and something would happen. And so I finally got fed up and frustrated because I can't change these devices. I'm just a patient. I'm not a doctor. I don't work for these medical device companies. What can we patients do? Well, in 2013, a couple of months later, something changed. I actually saw a tweet from a gentleman named John Kostick, who has a son who also had type 1 diabetes. And he was also frustrated with these devices for a different reason. His son would go to daycare or preschool or school, and the physical receiver would be at preschool. And so he, at work, would have no way to see what his son's blood sugars were. So he wanted to figure out a way to get data off the device so he could send it to the cloud and remotely view the data, which was great. And so he figured out how to do that, and he posted a picture of him doing that, and I went, ooh, that would be really cool if I could get my data off my device, send it to the cloud. I could send it to my phone and make my own louder alarm. If they won't do it, I'll do it for myself. And that's when the light bulb went off, because I had this idea for this louder alarm system, but until I saw John's tweet, I had no way to get my data off my device in past time, let alone in real time. And so that was a game changer, because it really made us ask the question, well, we can't change these existing devices, but what if we add additional tools that we create ourselves to solve our own problems? And that's exactly what we did. We were able to use John's code to upload it to a cloud and send it down to my phone to make a louder alarm. It worked really, really well. But we also decided, well, once you have your data, it's like the book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie, right? Like once you start, it's easy to do the next thing. So because we had the data in the cloud, we built a simple, ugly web page that would display my data, not for me, but for my loved ones who lived away from me. And we also built a tiered alarm system so that if I did not wake up to my alarm, it would then wake my loved ones and they could pick up the phone and call me. And this worked really well. And we added buttons to the system so that if I did wake up and take action, I'd press the button and it wouldn't wake anybody else up. It worked really, really well. And I was becoming a very well-trained guinea pig, because anytime I woke up and took action, I'd press the button. And I was like, well, okay, if I'm pressing the button that says I'm awake and doing something, I might as well press a specific button to say what I'm doing. I'm eating, I'm taking insulin, or leave me alone, I'm going back to sleep. And because I was entering this data, we realized between having all the data from the CGM, the glucose monitor, the data about what I was eating or drinking, and the data from the insulin, we could actually predict into the future what would happen with my blood sugars. And this was game-changing and life-changing, because before in manual diabetes, you were always reacting. You're low, take action. Your blood sugar is high, take action. And dozens of times a day you would hear that, but you were always reacting. But being able to paint a picture into the future with the data showed us that we could be proactive and predictive and make predictive alarms that would say, hey, you're going to go low in 72 minutes. But if you reduce your insulin, you're not going to go low, or you won't go as far low. And this was really, really powerful because it put more control back in my hands. Instead of just feeling like I was always low or high or low or high, I could actually decide, okay, I'm going into a meeting or I'm going up on stage. I want to set a higher target and be a little bit more conservative and make sure that I don't go low during this time period, or that I don't go high during this time period. And it worked really, really well. Now, I used this open loop system for about a year. I called it an open loop system because the system would tell me what to do. I would decide what to do, take action, and push a button. But within the course of a year, we talked with other people and realized, actually, we could build a closed loop system. We actually have everything we need to make an artificial pancreas. Because in an artificial pancreas, what you do is you put a computer to read the CGM and a computer to look at the insulin pump and to do the same math I was doing, but the difference is the computer does it every 5 minutes. The computer can decide what to do and tell the pump directly, give more or less insulin compared to normal. And the human can still do whatever we want to do. We can eat, we can do manual dosing, but in the background, this system will be running every 5 minutes and making small adjustments, more and less insulin as needed, based on those predictions to keep that prediction at the target level. And this worked incredibly well. If you remember, these were my graphs before. Every day, high, low, high, low, high, high, low, low. This was a good week, right? When my doctor was looking at it, I was trying my hardest. Well, within the first week of closing the loop, it made a huge difference. Flatline, 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 flatline. And my favorite part was this was 10, 12 hours on every graph that represented safe, peaceful sleep, where I didn't have to worry about going low or not hearing my alarm, because A, I now had louder alarms if I need it, but the best part was I was no longer generating alarms. I didn't need the alarms because I had built a system that took care of the problem for myself. So that's where the open APS movement came from. I had used code that was open source to solve my problems, to get data from the glucose monitor, to get data from the insulin pump. So we knew we wanted to share what we had done, which is putting the whole package together along with the decision-making algorithm, and we made it open source, thinking a couple other people would use it. And this is what the system looks like today. You have a standard insulin pump and glucose monitor, and then a small computer. So if you've notice this little red light on my hip? That's what that is. And you can see on the right a visualization you can see on your phone or your computer. Here's what the system is doing. It draws a purple line into the future, and you can see here's how it's deciding what it's doing. So I, as the human, can do whatever I want, but I can see the system working in the background. And the blue lines up and down show how it's adjusting my insulin in response to the green glucose numbers. Now, I said I thought a couple other people would use it, but the reality is there's thousands of people worldwide who are now using it. And it's pretty significant because I estimate in the last 5 years, we have over 15 million hours of experience. And this number is important because when you look at commercial systems that are starting to come to market, if you look at the pivotal trials, the big final clinical trials that are done to decide whether or not this should be approved by regulatory bodies, most of those clinical trials have something like 150,000 hours. And our community has 15 million hours of experience. So we have been still learning a lot about these systems and how to apply them in the real world, because when we're using these systems, these are not just us sitting still like perfect clinical trial participants. This is real life. We're eating food, we're traveling, we have jet lag, we fall off mountains, or at least I do, and break my ankle. We get sick. I mean, this is all real life where we've had this experience, and these systems are working really well. And we know this not only because I'm looking at my data, but we've also done studies from the community data. This is just kind of a summary slide showing a couple of different studies in comparison, but they also show the same trends. The time spent in target range goes up. Doesn't matter if you're 1 year old or 70 years old. Manual diabetes is hard, and automated systems help. Your average blood sugar goes down. The time you spend low and high goes down. This works really well. But we've also gotten pushback from the healthcare world saying, well, you know, that's a couple or a couple hundred patients, and that's real world data. Real world data is not really good data. You need different kinds of studies. You need prospective and randomized clinical trials. Well, this past year, and actually a couple months ago, somebody presented a prospective clinical trial where they put 23 patients on one of the open source systems. And what we found is the same thing all the other studies and data have shown, which is everybody does better. Their blood sugars are better at all times of day. No significant low blood sugars were happening. So this was really validating because we have these other studies and we have more on the way, including a randomized control trial using one of these open source systems that's continuing to show that the real world data matches what we're seeing in these studies, but also these systems are outperforming the first generation of commercial devices coming to market. So it's kind of interesting because we're showing here's what's working, and we were originally just trying to fill the gap, knowing that diabetes is so hard and there was nothing out there. But as these first systems are coming to market, we realize we have more that we can do in terms of pushing these systems to do better and to come to market more quickly, because people with diabetes are suffering in the meantime with not great quality of life. Now, when I talk about research, I like to point out that it feels like because we're doing all these studies, scientists and researchers feel like, okay, we've caught up with the bleeding edge. We're at the frontier. We're with you. But this isn't quite a fair portrayal of what's happening, because scientists have caught up to where we were 5 years ago. We've actually moved on. We've continued to innovate. We've continued to make our system better. And I think it's important to kind of compare the traditional innovation processes for healthcare and what patients are doing. And as we talk about digital innovation today, and especially digital for all, I think it's really important to think about what we've learned from patients. See, in healthcare, it's so easy to fall into what I call the patient syndrome trap. And it's kind of like imposter syndrome, where you may feel like you're the only person in the room who doesn't know anything and everybody around you knows so much more. Well, in healthcare, we kind of do the opposite, where anybody who works in healthcare can sometimes feel like they know everything from their training because they're a professional and they have expertise. But patients, they're not experts. They don't know as much as you do, but that's not true. While professionals who work in this space do have expertise, patients have learned expertise and lived expertise in their healthcare condition. So the reality is patients know a lot of stuff, and there's very little overlap. There's so much knowledge right now that's going completely untapped. And that's what I think we have to do, is change the way we're innovating and researching so that we do tap into this innovation and expertise. Because traditional innovation looks like this, where somebody is going to bring a car or a product to market. They're going to wait until they have their car done and it's gone through clinical trials and they get approved and they come to market. You wouldn't expect them to bring part of their solution to market. But you have to think about the problem that you're trying to solve. For a car, you're trying to solve how to get from point A to point B. Patients are walking, sometimes with crutches if you've broken your foot, and you want to go from point A to point B more quickly. And you might say, yeah, a car would be great, but I have no idea how to build a car. Who am I as the patient to build the car? I have no expertise in this, but I really understand the pain and the suffering and the struggles I'm having going from point A to point B for all these reasons. So what can we do? Well, here's a block of wood and some wheels. Let's make a skateboard. A skateboard's a little bit easier to go from point A to point B. And you use the skateboard and somebody sees you and comes along and says, hey, let's add steering and make it a scooter. And so you can steer a little bit better. Okay, let's do that. And you progress into having a bike and maybe an electric bike and then a car and then a self-driving car. And you've learned along the way what works well, what doesn't. And by the time you get to the point of having a self-driving car, you've actually been solving problems along the way, solving more problems than you thought you would be able to solve. And that's what I hope we take away from this, is recognizing that it doesn't have to be perfect. Small improvement in the quality of life for a patient can go a very, very long way. I think it's very easy to think about having the perfect product, the one-size-fits-all in healthcare, but the reality is patients could just have these small tweaks. A louder alarm is all I wanted, and that drastically changed the quality of my life and drastically changed the quality of life for so many other people. But you have to remember, anything is better than nothing. Waiting 5 years for the perfect product is not as good as having something that's imperfect but solves one particular problem that a patient is having. So anything is better than nothing. Getting started, getting something rolling out there is really great. And in digital innovation, as we're talking about, oftentimes the cost of iterating and prototyping is so much lower than if we were talking about hardware and medical devices. And so that's something that I think we need to bring from digital innovation into healthcare as well. And also the other thing to recognize is that patients can absolutely help, but we have to change the power structures in things like healthcare and research to partner equitably with patients. And what are some of the ways that we can do that? Well, first of all, I like to talk about the don'ts, which is if you're partnering with patients, don't expect to work the way you have before, because you're working with somebody who works outside the system. They're not part of the system, which is challenging, but also has opportunities. It's challenging because they're not being paid typically to do the work that they're doing and to help you, but they should be. But also they're not held down by the norms of the way things have always worked. And that's good because they'll see opportunities in different ways of working. And I think it's important to recognize that patients have different motivation for what they're doing. When you're working with a user from a community, they have a different motivation. That's not, this is their job, this is their profession, this is their real life. They're super highly motivated. But I think it is important to involve people at all stages of research. Don't just wait until the study is designed and say, what do you think? Don't do that unless you're willing to change your study design. You need to have patients and people involved from day one at even deciding, what should you be studying? What should you be developing? What should you be innovating? And you'll be surprised. It may not be what you think matters, but you're probably going to learn what is most important to a particular community. And I also think it's important to recognize that even though traditional stakeholders have expertise, they will learn new skills, just like the patient or the user from the community will also learn new skills. And finally, I think one super important thing to do is to calibrate on pace and expectations. We have a mantra in our community that came out of diabetes that I think applies to a lot of patient communities. It's #WeAreNotWaiting. We are not waiting because we can't afford to wait, because this is affecting us every single day. So we like to move very, very quickly. And sometimes when I partner with traditional researchers or talk with healthcare companies, they're talking about a 5-year timescale. And I want a 5-day or 5-week timescale. It's a little bit different. But when we have conversations, we can figure out what is the balance between my timescale and theirs, and how can we come up with, say, a 5-month timescale where we use the processes needed by the traditional stakeholders to go through regulatory committees, to go through clinical trials, but is also meeting patients where they are. So one of the tools that is out there now is something that I developed a part of a grant. It's called the Readiness Quiz. If you're thinking about working with patients in healthcare or users as any part of community and innovation, this is a good tool that will walk you through kind of assessing what skills do you have to offer a person in your community that you want to innovate with? How do you think you might change the way you work? And that way you can go into a conversation with your partner with your eyes open to the fact that you will be learning and they will be learning and you'll do it together. And talking about your pace and talking about your expectations and who is going to do what. It can be a really powerful tool, so I encourage you to check that out. But as we're talking today about digital innovation for all, I think it's really easy to look at people in the room, whether they're on stage or you talk to them during one of the breaks and feel like, okay, they're an exception. This person is exceptional, but they're an exception. This isn't everybody. A typical patient is not like this. A typical person in this community is not like this. They're the 1%. But I challenge you to think a little bit differently. If you think about the people that you encounter, not as exceptions, but think about us as the undiscovered rule. We're undiscovered by the traditional world, but that doesn't mean that there's not lots more of us out there. And I think, in fact, there definitely is. So with that, I'll stop and say, tack, and we are not waiting. Tack.
Tack. Tack, Dana. A really good presentation. I really like it. I wonder, what was your first drive, your motivator to start innovation at the first time?
I actually had a nightmare one night where I woke up paralyzed because of a low blood sugar and I wasn't able to reach a juice box on my bedside table. And I lay there thinking, I'm going to die, and this is what it feels like. And thankfully I woke up and it was just a nightmare, but that's really what spurred me to, I have to find a way to make a louder alarm. I have to do something. And then once I did my first thing, once we got the code to get my data off my device, I kind of realized I can do so much more. Once you have your data, we started solving all these other problems. We were able to build a predictive alarm and then an algorithm that's better than the world-class machine learning fancy algorithms. And it wasn't because we were trying to be, fancy and really good. We were just trying to solve the immediate problems and the next problem that we had. So it started with that nightmare, but it was really that drive to, let's do one more thing, one more small step. And a lot of those small steps added up very quickly.
Step by step. It
Step by
sounds
step.
easy when you tell us, but it can't be that easy.
It actually was easy. When you take a bite, one bite at a time, you can eat a whole elephant, but you have to do it a bite at a time.
But what do you think is important to enable a more patient-driven innovation?
I think it starts with having these kind of conversations about what does it take to change the system. I think right now the system often uses patients as tokens, but not full equitable participants in the research and innovation process. And so I think we have to change the structures and the incentives to make sure that patients are at the table from the start and not just tagged on at the end as kind of advisors, but are fully participating in the design process. I think that will make a big difference.
What are your dreams? What are you looking forward to?
I am looking forward to the day where every healthcare community has tools like this that they can build, or they have modular components coming from the healthcare community companies themselves, so the communities can have the right tools that work for them. I realize that in diabetes we've come a long way, but the commercial tools are never going to be perfect for me, but I would love to have a modular approach so I can tweak those tools and make them work for me and other people. But I would love to see that for all healthcare conditions. I think whether we're talking about COPD, as the previous speaker talked about, asthma, cancer, there's so many healthcare conditions where we can use data and we can use technology in new and different ways to solve problems that most of healthcare doesn't realize are problems for our quality of life. So I'm looking forward to empowering more people to feel empowered to start tackling those problems.
So new innovations to come?
Absolutely.
And in other areas?
Hopefully, yes.
And as diabetes as well. So inspiring. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
you.
Dana Lewis.
Tack.